Hi, today we're joined by Ben Watson. He is the Head of Digital Accessibility at UCL. He has over 7 years of experience working within accessibility directly in higher education. He has been recognised for his work, winning the Times Higher Education Award for Outstanding Student Support. Ben today will teach us more about accessibility. Thank you, Ben.
Hi everyone, and thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk to you about digital accessibility and give you a bit of a background and hopefully a good understanding of what the essential principles are. First thing I want to start with is, what is digital accessibility? I find it easiest to express this as a sort of equivalent to putting in ramps and lifts to information, which, you know, people are quite familiar with access to physical spaces, but the idea of access to digital information goes beyond just making stuff available on your website, you know, that anybody can access day or night, to making stuff work for everybody, and particularly people who face some accessibility barriers. So ensuring that visual content is available to people who can't see it, that there is, you know, text equivalents for things related to sound, so captions, for example, and that all of our systems can be interacted with by people using a wide range of assistive technologies. So on the screen, we've got a picture of a kind of slate-covered grey mountain lodge. And there's windows on the front and a door, and it's got a kind of gable end roof kind of facing us. And in the foreground, there are boulders. And on the side, each side of the building, you can see a kind of ramp with some supporting railings either side of the ramp. Now, this is an image of something called Gale Head Hut, which is part of the Appalachian Mountain Club's portfolio of kind of retreats. But the key thing to know about this is it's 12 hours hike up a mountain, and this is proper hiking, you know, like, you know, ropes and climbing over waterfalls, and it takes all day to get there. No roads, no kind of immediate ease of access to it. And when it was being built, the Appalachian Mountain Club were told by the Americans with Disabilities Act that they had to make this accessible. And they went back to the American government and said, I don't think that's required here. That would be an awful lot of extra expense. And this building is 12 hours up a mountain. You know, who in a wheelchair is going to be taking the time to come and, you know, access this building? Brilliantly, a local university disabled mountaineering club heard about this and decided to take the challenge. And there's some great footage of these young people getting there in their wheelchairs, with, you know, being hauled up these waterfalls, a really, you know, triumphant experience. And at nightfall, you can see them arriving so that they can use the accessible entrances to this mountain lodge. And there's a reporter waiting for them, and the reporter says to the lead climber, you've just climbed 12 hours up rock faces and waterfalls to get here. Why does having a step on this lodge matter when you finally get here? And the lead climber says something I think is really interesting. They said, well, if that's your attitude, why do you bother putting in doors for anybody? Why don't you just expect people without disabilities to haul themselves in through the windows? And I think the point they were making is that things that are there to make things easier for people without disabilities are seen as, you know, absolute essential items, but they aren't always seen as the same thing for people with disabilities. And why not? The principle is exactly the same. And of course, the Appalachian Mountain Club have found, of course, that, you know, where they have emergency situations and they need to move people around in kind of stretchers or accept deliveries or anything like that, everything's easier when you make stuff accessible, because it just is. Accessible stuff is always good stuff and better design. So that's essentially the premise of what I'm going to talk to you about today, that doing things in an accessible way in the digital space is a way to always make things better. It's not going to mess it up for people who don't have accessibility requirements. It always makes things better. So 3 main reasons why this is important. So there's an ethical reason, as we've kind of just heard, it's the right thing to do. There's a usability argument. Everything is improved. If we make our websites and our digital systems accessible, they're more discoverable. Therefore, our research potentially has a greater audience and therefore potential greater impact. People can more easily find information, navigate it, and consume it in a range of different formats that suits their particular requirements. So that potentially has impacts on things like student satisfaction, which then directly affects things like the teaching excellence framework, and the research excellence framework similarly impacted by the discoverability of resources and the ease of consumption and sharing of those resources. And finally, there is legislation that says we have to do this. But I don't think legislation should be the primary motivator here. I think the top two are way more important. So even if there wasn't legislation, this is still the right thing to do. A couple of bits of student feedback from some research I did last summer. I just want to let you know feedback from students when things don't go well and we don't provide information in a way that works. Honestly, it kind of makes me question my future. Like, if they're not adapting any of the learning materials, why even bother to put in the effort? Makes me lose confidence in learning and whether I'm going to be able to actually get a job or go to uni or pursue what I want to do. I sometimes feel like I just get ignored. So that was a third year computer science student with a visual impairment. And the second bit of feedback is from another visually impaired student. I feel I'm a good learner and I want to learn. Unfortunately, the big impact is I can't really do it on my own. And that was a third year music production student. Now, let's think about, we've just spoken about how this makes people feel potentially, and there's lots of research done in an area of equality, diversity and inclusivity around, microaggressions, which are these kind of daily oversights that, where people's requirements aren't always respected, and often this is unintentional, but people aren't their requirements aren't fully anticipated by an organization, and over time, cumulatively, this can create a sense that the organization doesn't care about people, and then that can affect kind of well-being and a sense of belonging. But the opposite to microaggression is this lovely term called microkindness, or sometimes it's also called microaffirmation. But I think microkindness is exactly what we're talking about. Exactly, accessibility, inclusive design is all about taking the time to anticipate the requirements of everybody who is going to want to use our systems or services and building in their requirements before they have to tell us about them, but just because we do it because it's the right thing to do. So microkindness is reducing these microaggressive interactions with brief verbal, behavioral or environmental acts of respect. Unlike microaggressions, microkindnesses are deliberate. They're consciously intended to provide a potential space for positive and humanizing interaction. So when you sit down to design your next assessment, the next document you do, the next email you send, just have a think about, well, how would somebody with a visual impairment access this? How would somebody who perhaps can't hear any of the video content I'm creating access it? What about people, if this is appropriate to your audience, what about people with learning disabilities? How can we make our information as clean and clear as possible, explaining any acronyms that we're using, any jargon, terminology? How can we just make it work really well for everybody? A good example of usability, and one of the usability benefits of accessibility, is a watch, which I've now got on the screen, and it's a black watch with a circular dial, and on the outer area of the dial is some raised indices that mark the hours, and on a circular inner channel there is a silver ball bearing that tracks round and is effectively the hour hand. There's no glass on this watch. The inner ball bearing is a magnet on a magnetized movement, and just on the edge of the main dial there you can see another ball bearing just kind of peeping out from the 2 o'clock position, and this is a watch that you can access fully in a tactile way. So this was designed by a student for his visually impaired friend, And he noticed that his friend felt very self-conscious checking the time in things like lectures. And it's kind of obvious because someone with a visual impairment will use a watch, a talking watch, and when they press a button audibly, it tells the time. But if you're kind of clock watching because you're a bit bored in a lecture or a seminar, it's not very discreet, and it's potentially quite embarrassing. So for everybody concerned, so he designed this watch for his friend that could be you can tell the time in a tactile way, but you can also look at it visually. So I think the overall effect of it is a really lovely timepiece that everybody could be very proud to own and wear. The legislation itself is called the Public Sector Bodies Websites and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations. And this effectively says that public sector bodies need to take measures to ensure websites and mobile applications are accessible by design. And they use a particular set of 4 main principles called perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, which are the 4 main pillars of something called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a set of measurements for assessing the accessibility of digital systems. Now, we've come a long way in terms of technology and what technology can enable. So on the screen, I have a picture of a sculptor, who's just finishing off, putting the final touches to a sculpture of a young boy reading Braille. And it's a relatively famous sculpture called the Braille Reader. This used to be in the main hallway of a place I used to work called the Royal London Society for the Blind. And the thing with Braille is that it's an amazing format, and lots of people still use it, and it's a brilliant way of communicating and sharing information. But it can be quite difficult to, or historically it was quite difficult to source, and there wasn't necessarily the kind of ease of kind of access to materials to read, really widely across a subject, because perhaps you were sometimes limited by the amount of stuff that was in Braille and the time it may take to create some Braille resources. Now, because of where we are with modern technology and the way that we now know how to make things more accessible, there's some amazing technologies that people can use, such as Refreshable Braille. So the principle is exactly the same as the kind of more traditional versions of Braille, where it was printed on card. But now Refreshable Braille is digitally is delivered via a digital means, and on the screen we've got a picture of a Refreshable Braille device, and we've got a person with their finger being pressed to the raised Braille dots, markers, and this means that they can have information generated in a digital way and almost instantly converted to a Braille format that they can read in a very mobile and responsive way. But we can only benefit from these amazing technological advances if we create information in the right way. And there are some really basic things we need to get right in the presentation of our digital information in order that we don't stand in the way of it being served up for all kinds of different assistive technologies to allow people to tailor the information consumption to the means that suit them best, whether they have a disability or not. So some basic principles to be aware of: alternate text descriptions for any visual materials in your documents, presentations. And the key thing here is that the alternate text descriptions have to be meaningful. So you wouldn't just say picture of Eiffel Tower if you were delivering an architecture lesson where it was all about, the engineering of the Eiffel Tower and the particular types of rivets that were used. You'd be more specific. So give a meaningful contextual description of why that image is there, so somebody who can't see it can get the same value from it. Documents need to have a sensible structure so that people can easily navigate if they can't browse visually up and down a document looking for particular sections. If we create clear tables of contents, they can be linked to, and screen readers can look at those tables of contents and allow people to instantly browse to different headings, so they don't have to listen to the whole document before they get to the the bit of it that's of interest to them. There's a particular way that you create hyperlinks, again, to make them meaningful to screen readers. And the same thing with tables. It's really important tables are structured in a way that allows the header row to be seen as something different from the general rows that sit beneath it, in order that a screen reader can identify the header row as something special and something to be treated differently, and it will read the table in a much more sequential and meaningful way as a result. All of the guidance on how to do this will be included in the YouTube links associated with this video. With colour, obviously you want a decent level of contrast between any text that you use and any background colours that are chosen. And please don't ever overlay text over images. That's nearly always a very bad idea. And also, don't make colour the only means of conveying information. So don't say, for example, you need to complete all the red fields in this form. Very difficult for people to navigate if they can't see colour for whatever reason. Giving a range of formats. So, ideally, don't just give people a PDF. Ideally, give people Word documents, give them web pages, or create a really good central resource that can readily be exported to a range of alternate formats that will produce really well. The main kind of principle here is, if you put rubbish in, you'll get rubbish out. If we put really great, well-designed, accessible information together, we'll get really great assistive technology outputs from it. And in nearly every system now, particularly Microsoft Office related systems, there are ways to check the accessibility of your work. Much like you would run a spell check, you can run accessibility checks. And again, links to how to do that are in the guidance attached to this video. I'm just going to go back to those 4 main principles that underpin the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which, if you remember, is the set of standards that the public sector bodies, websites and mobile applications accessibility regulations 2018 are using to understand whether people are being compliant. So this is what effectively we're being measured against. And the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are actually about 50 criteria that measure a lot of the sorts of things we've talked about today. Is there a sensible structure to your information? Can it be interacted with in a number of different ways? And we'll go through this in more detail in a moment. And it looks at things like color contrast, all the things you'd expect. But the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, those 50 core, they call them success criteria, are housed under different sections of these main principles. So we've got perceivable, operable, understandable and robust, and they spell the acronym POUR. But I think these are useful things to have in your head whenever you're designing anything. And these are almost a set of kind of questions you can ask yourself as you sit down to design something that you want people to interact with. Just have a think about how you would achieve each of these basic principles. Okay, so the first one, perceivable. So the criteria says information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways that they can perceive. And it literally means that. Can people perceive it with the senses they have available to them? So if somebody can't see some information, we spoke earlier on about, giving text alternatives to visual information. How are we going to look after them in a different way? If somebody can't hear a narrative on your video, have we got captions to bring it to life for them? And can people serve up that information in different ways? So if somebody wants to use a level of magnification, will the system support that so that they can serve up the material in a way that really suits their individual requirements? So what we're talking about here is creating information that doesn't stand in anyone's way. So a quick example from the physical world of something perhaps not being perceivable. So these are some stairs outside the Templeman Library at the University of Kent. What we've got here is a photograph of some steps outside the Templeman Library at the University of Kent. And we're looking at some red brick built steps that are all facing vertically. And the overall effect of all of these bricks and the kind of in their vertical, serried rows, is that because there's no clear contrast edging to the edge of these steps, it almost has the optical illusion of being a flat surface or even possibly a ramp, but certainly doesn't look like some steps. There are railings either side of the set of steps that we're looking at, but other than that, there's no real distinction to tell you, give you your bearings when you were finding your way up and down these steps. And this is a photograph that was sent to me by a student with a visual impairment, and I just want to read to you what she said about these steps. These stairs outside just completely put a stop on my day and make me really nervous. The threat of falling down because they're all the same facing brick. There's no distinction between the stairs. I think it's something like the fact that I get on with things so independently. It's the fact that such a small thing can so regularly jar me back into having to stop and go, oh, I'm disabled. I'm going to have to go over here and do this. And what she was talking about was that she was in the library, getting on with her studies. The University of Kent has a good reputation for making a lot of its materials accessible, and she was getting on reading books in the library, and everything was really good. And she almost kind of forgot that she was visually impaired because she was just studying in the same time and space as everyone else, which is exactly what we're talking about today. However, when she came to leave the library, she was faced with these steps, and her friends kind of gingerly made their way down the steps. But this particular student lost all her confidence and kind of went an alternate route. And it was a really awkward, unnecessary experience. And if we think back to kind of microaggressions and those kind of cumulative effects of these constantly having your requirements overlooked, perhaps this is a good example of that. And what's interesting is that when we raised this, with the University Estates team, lots of people kind of fed back similarly. But even if they didn't have a disability or visual impairment, they said, do you know what, I find those steps really awkward. You just can't quite get your bearings on them and you feel like you're going to fall over. And I'm very pleased to say that they have now got very high contrast edging to them to improve the legibility of them. So that was perceivable. Operable. Can the interface literally be interacted with, operated by people who wish to use it? Probably one of the main examples of this is if somebody can't see or has limited mobility and perhaps can't use a mouse to point at a particular element of a user interface, is there an alternative way that they can get access? So if they can't see where the little kind of submit button is it possible for them to navigate to that submit button for that form they've just completed in a different way? And typically this would just be by pressing the tab key on the keyboard, and a screen reader, for example, will read out the name of each element as it lands on it. Each focusable element will then have its name read. For example, a person may be navigating a desktop and they're cycling through a range of icons for different bits of software, and they come to the Microsoft Word icon and they say, yes, that's the one I want. They'll press enter and then it will open Microsoft Word, and then they will start navigating by keyboard again through the different menus within Microsoft Word to choose, the particular interaction they wish to have. So can it be operated in a range of different ways? Let's have a think about, have we set any kind of time limits on the way that people create information? Banking websites are kind of notorious for this because of security reasons. They sometimes time out before a person's had a chance to finish typing in their information. I had a very good friend of mine who had Parkinson's, and although he could still operate a mouse, it just took him a little bit longer, and navigating his banking website was always problematic, and he was nearly always getting frustrated by a timeout before he finished halfway through typing in his details. We don't want sites that are going to be kind of too whizzy and flashing and loads of moving content that people can't control, which could cause seizures. So and it's just, are you able to navigate the various menus, and does it all make sense and it follows a kind of meaningful sequence? Again, the link to this will be in the YouTube notes below, but there's a brilliant exercise you can take to get a sense of what it might feel like when a website doesn't behave in a way that you expect it to. So user in your face is an exercise in frustration, and things that look like buttons don't behave like buttons. The contrast isn't very good. But the reason that I'm sharing this is that I think as a kind of exercise in just understanding how potentially frustrating it is if every time you went to, I don't know, book a wheelie bin slots with your local council, you faced these challenges because systems hadn't been designed to work in a way that accommodated your access requirements, you would feel similarly frustrated. So POU, understandable. Information and the operation of user interfaces must be understandable. So is the text readable and understandable? Have we explained any acronyms we're using? Are we using plain English? Does the navigation behave in a predictable way? If I'm filling in a form and I make a mistake, maybe I don't enter my postcode in quite the right way, does the system tell me what I've done wrong and a very clear bit of guidance on how to fix it? And crucially, is that information communicated in a way that people who can't see it can understand what to do about it? So is that information an alert provided to screen readers so they know where they've made the error and immediately what they need to do to fix it so they can carry on with their journey? Another quick example of understandable from the physical world is another photograph taken by a student at the University of Kent, a student who was in their first week. And this was a student who had a specific learning requirement and anxiety, but probably not surprising, thinking of it was the first week at university. And what we've got is an image of two opaque double doors next to each other. No real clear signage on those doors, and no windows in them to let you know what's going on behind those doors. To the right hand side, there's an enormous red signpost with it's probably 6 foot high, 4 foot wide, and there's a big white arrow in the middle of this red sign. And above and below the arrow, it says DLT1, DLT2. Now, what the student was taking the photograph for was to say she didn't understand what those acronyms meant, which meant that she didn't know which one was Darwin Lecture Theatre and which Darwin Lecture Theatre 1 and which was Darwin Lecture Theatre 2. And she stood outside, and because there's no glass in the doors, she couldn't look inside to see, you know, if that was her lecture and people she recognized. And she didn't want to kind of commit to opening a door and, you know, being kind of exposed to this whole room of people and knowing that she potentially made a mistake in which room. And although we've put an enormous sign there, we actually didn't do a very good job because we assumed everybody would understand what our local acronyms mean. And that was a real shame because it made this person late for their lecture. And again, they felt similarly that it was kind of their fault and that affected, you know, their well-being. So the kind of thing where, you know, that's why it's so important that we make our stuff understandable and we don't assume that everybody has the, you know, institutional knowledge that we all have as perhaps members of staff, you know. And the final one, POUR, robust, is content should be robust enough that it can be interpreted and compatible with a wide range of assistive technologies, of course. So, you know, does it work with screen readers? Will it work with magnification? Will it allow people to change color options and you can still see everything? But if I want my document delivered with a black background and yellow text, it should support that because that's my particular preference. So remember, this is all about creating information that doesn't stand in anyone's way. Have we tested it across a range of mobile devices? Does it work on Apple devices? Will it work on Windows? And what about in the future? If we're using a really good bit of software at the moment that's really accessible, how can we be reassured that if there's a new update, that it's going to similarly respect the good accessibility work that went before and won't undo any of that good work? There's a range of technologies that you can use to help you in this journey. So part one of our challenge is to create good accessible information. Part two is pointing people at really good assistive technologies that they can use to maximize the value of that information we've just created for them. And again, I don't think this just relates to people with disabilities. I think everybody can benefit from some of these really amazing assistive technologies that, for example, will read your document to you, that will allow you to convert your document into a mobile audio format so you could listen to it being read to you while you're out for a jog in the evening or taking the dog for a walk. It's about the way we consume information. And if we, thinking right back to Go-Ahead Hut at the beginning, if we make our information accessible, it just works well for everyone, and anybody can do anything they want with it. And that's the real magic thing we're talking about here. My final point, and this is a student who I spent a lot of time with and I learned a great deal from, a student called Vincent from the University of Kent, and he gave me possibly one of the best bits of feedback I've ever had about how to really understand user requirements for people with disabilities. So Vincent said, I'm always telling non-disabled people that the best way to approach a disabled person is with the question, how can I help? Because from that, I know you want to help. You don't know how to help. You trust me that I can explain, and you don't have any preconceptions which can destroy the helping process. So all the things we've spoken about today are brilliant things for you to embed as part of your practice. They will remove barriers for a big number of people, a vast majority of people, but there is always benefit from talking to individuals and understanding what their particular requirements are so that we can stretch that level of accessibility even further. Let's, keep raising the bar year on year and always trying to improve as the technologies improve. Let's work with them. And my final message is, there's on the screen now, I've got a little cartoon character. He's a little cartoon cricket called Jiminy Cricket. He's wearing sort of Victorian period clothes, and he's got a top hat that he's doffing to us, and he's holding an umbrella in his left hand. And he's smiling, and he's a very cheerful little chap. And he is effectively Pinocchio's conscience. So from the Walt Disney film, or the historic, I think, Italian fairy story, fairy tale, not fairy story, sorry, fairy tale, Italian fairy tale. And he's Pinocchio's conscience, and Pinocchio, for people who aren't familiar with it, he is a puppet, and whenever he tells an untruth, his nose grows longer. But the reason I'm mentioning Jiminy Cricket now is Jiminy Cricket sort of, lives metaphorically on Pinocchio's shoulder, and he kind of whispers in his ear and gives him advice, and presumably to keep him on the straight and narrow so he doesn't keep lying all the time. But the reason I'm mentioning this is I think we all need a virtual Jiminy Cricket on our shoulder. Whenever we sit down to design anything, whether it's an assessment, a document, an email, an event, just have that thought. How's this going to work for someone who can't see it? How would this work for someone with low mobility? How would this work for someone who can't hear it? What about people for whom English isn't their first language? Let's just think about the range of people in our audience and design for everybody in the room. And I promise you, if you do that, it will just be a beautiful design and information experience for everyone. And this isn't about doing anything that's going above and beyond what is anything other than an ethical baseline. And a final bit of feedback from a student involved in that previous bit of research I mentioned. The big thing about accessibility is you just want to feel the same as everyone else. No special favors, nothing going above and beyond, just giving people the same equitable level of access so they can realize their potential.
Ben, that was fantastic. We have run over time, so I won't ask a question, but it's so many points. I learned new things, and I've been working with people with severe vision impairment in my previous job, and I wish I had watched this video beforehand. I've written down so many points that I want to continue in conversation, but I've summed it up with the 2 words: bloody brilliant. I am so relieved that I've had this conversation with you. And I wish I could ask 100 questions. I will include all of the links that have been mentioned down below. And I think the concept of micro kindness is amazing. And I hope people take that on. And I hope institutions can implement micro kindness and actually turn it into macro kindness, because I think places like the NHS could learn so much from you. and your expertise. And one other thing before I go is I want to comment on your description of what's appearing on screen. I think this is a micro kindness that lots of people can take with them, and it'll help people with vision impairment, or potentially people who don't know what Victorian garb looks like, because I learnt that from you about Jiminy Cricket. So it's not just people with vision impairment, but I think just giving a description of what's appearing on screen is an amazing act of micro kindness. So thank you so much. I've learned, I'm in debt to you because my knowledge is just blown through the glass ceiling of what I perceived accessibility is about. So really appreciate it, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you very much.